We'll get started. I'm Adam Rose. I'm the director of the USC Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorism Events. Despite the title, we're really an all-hazard center, so hence our interest in pandemics. I'm also a research professor in the Price School of Public Policy. So joining me today are two members of the research team, Terrie Walmsley, who's a research fellow at CREATE and is officially joining Dornsife College in the fall semester, and Dan Way, who's a research fellow at CREATE as well, and associate professor on the research track in the Price School. So let me begin with slide number 2 by way of background. The work we're doing is part of an overall broad effort to study the macroeconomic impacts of the pandemic. And the presentation today is our first product of our short-term analysis using secondary data, where we're focusing only on the mandatory closures and holding other things constant. We've been informed that we're going to get funding to do a longer-term analysis, which will involve the collection of primary data on things like health costs, avoidance behavior, pent-up demand. And we've also been informed that we're likely to receive some funding from the CDC to look at impacts of proposed new rules on contact tracing. And finally, potentially some work from NASA, where we would be provided with some satellite data on population movements that relate to openings of businesses and avoidance behavior fed into our macro model. So our initial analysis is the macro impacts of the closures. And what we've done is evaluated the status with respect to these for the US and the rest of the world as of April 7th. And we've used a multi-country computable general equilibrium model to be explained in detail in a while, and done 2 scenarios, a 3- and 6-month closure. So we are finding that our estimate for the employment decline from baseline for the 3-month case is on the order of an employment decline of 22.4%, which is pretty much on the mark of where the economy is actually heading. So I think we've got a pretty good estimate. Let's go to slide number 3. And slide number 3 is a slide that describes where we started in terms of our scenarios that we were interested in running. And these are the scenarios that we thought of in early March, and obviously time has moved on and we'll need to update these. You know, we once thought maybe there's a possibility this will be mild and contained, but our scenarios will be revamped to take into account even more severe possibilities down the road. So finally, for slide number 4, I just want to outline the presentation. Dr. Way will be going next and providing a summary of data inputs and with the details there. Dr. Walmsley will be providing a summary of the methodology and the major results, and then I'll come back on and wrap things up with the conclusion slide. So Terrie, let me turn it over to you.
Okay, so I think I will go next and talk about...
Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So, okay, so first of all, I would like to provide a summary of the major data sources that we used in this study, as well as some additional assumptions that we adopted in the simulations. So first of all, in order to figure out the proportion of US economy that is affected by the mandatory closures, we referred to the New York Times interactive map, which shows the states in the US that implemented statewide or a partial stay-at-home orders. And they updated that map periodically. So for this short-term study focusing just on mandatory closures, we actually used the map, the mandatory closure map as of April 7th. And what we did next is to identify the economic sectors that are subject to the mandatory closures. This is based on the list of essential critical infrastructure sectors under COVID-19 that is defined by the DHS Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And then because different states have different industry compositions, in order to figure out the direct GDP or production that are affected by the closure orders in the US for each industrial sectors, we use the Bureau of Economic Analysis GDP data by economic sectors and also for different states to figure out the percentage shutdown of the economic sectors for the entire country as an aggregate. And then finally, we also considered the telework potentials in terms of the output that can be produced by telecommuting for the non-essential sectors that are covered by the mandatory closures, and figured out how telecommuting can help to reduce the direct impacts from the mandatory shutdowns. So these data are estimated based on the results of Bureau of Labor Statistics American Time Use Survey. So on the next slide, so this is the New York Times map that shows the mandatory closures that had been imposed across the states in the US. So this map was from April, this is the update on April 7th. So we can see that according to this map, 42 states plus Washington, DC had implemented statewide stay-at-home orders. So those are the dark orange states on the map. And also we see that there were another 3 states implemented such orders in parts of the state. So altogether, these states accounts for about 97% of the total US economy. Essentially, that's the percentage of US economy that is affected by the stay-at-home orders. And then let's go to the next slide. So this slide presents additional assumptions on the mandatory closure simulations. So first, let's look at the geographical area that is affected. So we have just seen the extent of geographical coverage of the US economy under the mandatory closure orders. And for China and most other large countries, those countries have similar non-essential sector shutdown policies in place as well. But most of those countries, such orders are just implemented within part of their countries. So next, for smaller countries that have implemented similar policies, we assume that that orders are imposed throughout the entire economy in those smaller countries. And finally, for countries without a similar shutdown policies or have not implemented explicit closure policies, we simply assume that they will reduce their productions in their non-essential sectors by 5%. And next, in terms of the duration of the mandatory closures, as Dr. just mentioned, we simulated 2 scenarios, cases. One is 3 months closures and the other is 6 months closures for the US. And we assume the same durations of closure for the rest of the world, except for China. So in the 3 months scenario, we assumed a 3-week equivalent shutdown in China's economy. And this is in line with the actual shutdowns experienced in the country earlier in 2020. And in the 6 months closure scenario, we assumed a six-week shutdown in China. So this represents a combination of the equivalent 3-week actual closures in the country, as well as the contingency or some possible further shutdown of some of its economy if there is any possibility of re-emergence of COVID-19 threat in the country later in the year. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. All right, so in terms of the impacts of closures on different economic sectors, we first divided the sectors into 3 categories. So the first category refers to those sectors based on the sectoring scheme that we used in our economic model. So these sectors fall entirely under the non-essential category. So these sectors are simulated as completely shut down in our simulation. So some examples of such sectors include non-critical manufacturing sectors, recreation and entertainment, education, and some other sectors as well, categorized as non-essential sectors or services. However, for many of these sectors, we considered telework potentials that can help to reduce the direct impacts from the shutdowns. We will talk more about this in a moment. And then the second category of the sectors refers to those that only some of their subsectors are non-essential. So some examples here include retail trade. For example, the closure would exclude grocery store, special food store, gas station, so on and so forth. And another example is food services. The shutdown would exclude any takeout services. And also for business services, any other essential services such as waste management or some administrative support services are excluded from the closures. And finally, the third category refers to those sectors that provide essential, produce essential goods or provide essential services. So these sectors are assumed to maintain their operations to the extent possible in our simulations. So the examples here include agriculture sectors, utilities, healthcare, and critical manufacturing sectors that include, for example, food processing, chemicals, medical equipment, or pharmaceutical products manufacturing. Okay, so I think we can go to the next slide. All right, so this table presents the telework potentials for different sectors. Okay, so these percentages are calculated based on the BLS American Time survey results for 2017 to 2018. So for example, in terms of workforce flexibility, people were asked questions such as part of your job, whether you would be able to work from home. So the percentage of workers that answered yes in different sectors to this question are shown in the first numerical column. And people were also asked questions such as whether or not you actually ever worked at home, at least occasionally. So the percentage of people who answered yes to this question is shown in the second numerical column. So again, the first column shows the feasibility, the flexibility and actually feasibility of workers from different sectors to work from home. And the second column shows the actual percentage of workers actually did that in 2017, 2018. In our study, we calculate the average of these two sets of percentages and used in our simulation. So those percentages are shown in the last column. We can see that the ability of work from home actually vary greatly from industry to industry. ranging from less than 8% for workers working in leisure and hospitality industries to over 50% for people employed in like financial activities and professional and business services. All right, so on the next slide, we present the direct effects of mandatory closures in terms of the percentage reduction of output by sector. So the second to last column in this table shows different mandatory closure categories for each sector I just talked about. And in this table, we exclude all the sectors that are in category 3. So in other words, this table excludes all the essential sectors for which we assume there's zero direct impacts from mandatory closures. And then the percentages of direct output reductions in those different non-essential sectors or partial non-essential sectors, those percentages have already factored in telework potentials. So here we actually distinguish two subsectors, subcategories of non-essential sectors that experience mandatory closures. So for sectors that they can produce output or still provide services by telecommuting, such as professional services, finance, or education, we apply the telecommuting percentages we just saw in the previous table to determine the proportion of output that can still be produced in those sectors. And then for those non-essential sectors that it would be very difficult for them to produce their output by telecommuting. So namely, most of the non-essential or the non-critical manufacturing sectors, we assume that those sectors will not produce any product for the supply chain in our simulations. However, I believe in the next phase of our study, the income that can be generated by telecommuting activity, so for example, in the form of administrative or clerical work by in those sectors, will be considered in our simulation as continued income earned by those workers in those sectors. We will also simulate the spending effects when people spend those income to purchase things and the injections of those spending streams into the economy. Okay, I think that's this slide. Terry, so maybe you can go on.
Thank you. So the focus was definitely on mandatory closures, but I guess this is a global model, and we need to think also about trade. And in that particular case, not only have there been restrictions on mandatory closures, there's also been restrictions on international trade flows. So what we also did was impose some restrictions on trade in services which required tourism or the movement of people. And basically that requires anything related to construction requires that people actually move in order to provide the construction services. Accommodation and food services are definitely very much about tourism. And then some of the other sectors that are listed here also require some movement of people. So when we look at services trade data, we generally think of them as being, as how are they provided? So we've looked at sort of the data behind how these are provided. Does it require a movement of person? And if it does, then we've restricted some of the trade related to how dependent it is on that movement of people. So that's in addition to the mandatory closures, we also reduce the services trade in some of the services sectors. So that's our shocks for the moment. As we've been trying to indicate, this is sort of an ongoing process. So putting in things like people getting sick isn't in this particular study, but it'll be in our future studies. So it's just concentrating on mandatory closures and these trade. what we do is we put it into a rather large model, a global general equilibrium model, which contains about 141 countries and 65 goods and services. We aggregate this model up into USA, China, and rest of world. They're the ones we've concentrated on because obviously our focus is on the US. But we keep as much detail on the sectors. So we keep all 65 goods and services underlying this model. It's a general equilibrium model, and what that means is it's basically, it has a database underlying it, which shows input-output tables for every single country. And these input-output tables tell you how a good is produced in that country and where the products are sold in that country. So who consumes the goods, the consumers or the firms and so forth. And those input-output tables are then linked by trade data. So there's an input-output table for all 141 countries or regions, and it's linked by trade. The model is based on the GTAP model. It's a slightly modified version, which is very widely used for trade and environmental work. And the way it works in terms of the model theory is basically we have this regional household that collects its income from wages and returns to capital and its ownership of land. And then it allocates that income out to consumption, which could be domestic or foreign, and savings. That's the household side. On the other side, you have the firms which actually produce these goods. So there's a certain amount of demand from the domestic market and from foreign market. The firms then produce to meet that demand, and in order to produce, they usually have to buy some intermediate inputs and some factors of production. Factors of production being, they might need some land or some capital, they might need some production workers or sales staff. So all these are brought together in order to produce the goods. And then some of the other aspects of the model, there are taxes on basically everything, on consumption, on your value added, on incomes and trade. And not only do households consume, but obviously the government consumes as well. And then any savings that is done, that funds investment globally. And the general equilibrium, I guess, comes from the fact that it all has to add up. So demand has to equal supply. What comes in as income has to equal expenditure. So that's kind of a rough overview of the model that we're using. And as I said, it's 141 countries, but we aggregate this up to USA, China, and the rest of the world. They're the countries that we're interested in. Now we report, in this particular paper, there's a lot of other results, but we report the real GDP and the employment impacts. The way to think about this is it's a comparative static analysis. So we're looking at the changes in real GDP. We're not looking at them over time, we're looking at the changes in real GDP in sort of a short run. So in 1 or 2 years' time, how far has GDP gone down because of all these mandatory closures, or how far has employment gone down? It's not a time, there's no time frame in it, so we can't say the employment's rising unemployment is rising and then falling off as we recover. We hope to do that in some of the further work that we get into, but this one is just sort of comparative static. What does it look like after 1 or 2 years? And that short run is defined by a couple of things. We have sector-specific capital. So capital can't move from one sector to another. It just becomes underemployed. And obviously we have unemployment of labor. And then the final assumption is that we fix the trade balance. And that essentially is just to stop investment going to the rest of the world. So, the US looks bad at the moment. Compared to the rest of the world, you might expect investment to go out, but it's a short run analysis. That investment isn't running out of the country, so we fix that amount of investment. So what are the impacts? So we find the impacts are quite large. So in the terms of the 3-month closure, so when we have 3 months of mandatory closures, GDP is going down by about 20%. And that's about $4.3 trillion US. So it's quite a large decline. In 6 months, if there's 6 months worth of closures, then obviously that more than doubles, slightly more than doubles. Over time, things are getting worse. it's just not linear. The negative consequences tend to be more for the US than they do for China and the rest of the world, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that the mandatory closures in the US, as Dan explained, are a lot tougher. There's the mandatory closures for 97% of the states, and while China only shuts down for 3 weeks, and the rest of the world, while Britain is doing badly, the rest of the world as a whole, it's a mixed bag. Some countries have shut down, some countries haven't, and we tried to get into the detail of which countries had and which countries hadn't. The other thing that is interesting with the US is that the US is a rich country. They tend to produce a lot of non-essential goods, and they tend to demand a lot of non-essential goods. So as a result, non-essentials make up a large share of their economy. So that's another reason why the USA does particularly badly. The negative impacts overall, so the closures obviously in one sector are negatively impacting other sectors. So it's not just that we're closing down the restaurant business, but the restaurant business buys agriculture, and as a result, they're going to demand less agriculture. Now, households might pick up some of that slack because now they're having to eat from home, so they're going to buy different goods, but different agriculture. And I guess that's the problem, is they don't buy all the agriculture. They may not eat as many vegetables when they're at home. So there's these supply chain effects that we talk about. When restaurants close, the vegetable market declines more because because of the restaurant closure. And then obviously the other impact, the other reason for the negative is because we have unemployment. So when we have these huge impacts on GDP declines 20%, there's this shedding of workers become unemployed, and as a result, they have less money, so they demand less goods. So that has further negative effects. So your negative effects end up being much larger than just the mandatory closures. And we see this kind of thing in the press at the moment, where different sectors are having more negative impacts, not just the mandatory closures. There's these flow-on effects to the rest of the economy. So in terms of unemployment, so these are our impacts on unemployment. On employment. So we actually find that employment declines by 22%, so slightly more than the impact on real GDP. And again, this stems from the fact that the US economy tends to produce more non-essential items. It's the non-essential items that are getting hit more. Non-essential items tend to have more workers, particularly in the US, where agriculture is more capital intensive, or production is more capital intensive. All your workers are in those non-essential services sectors, so you tend to get rather large changes in your unemployment, and that tend to be quite slightly larger than our impacts on GDP. Whereas China and the rest of the world, not so capital intensive in their agriculture. People are working their essential sectors, so they don't get unemployed. Okay, so this here is a bit of just a summary of the types of things that I said. So the negative impacts are quite considerable. The impacts tend to be greater. The direct effects of the mandatory closures are much smaller than the total effects, and that's because of all these unemployed workers with less money to spend, and the supply chain effects that I was talking about, in particular with the restaurant. The impacts in the US are larger because of this importance of non-essential sectors to the US economy. Okay, so that's basically an interpretation of the results. I'll hand it over to Adam again to make some conclusions.
So just a summary, the 3-month case resulted in an estimate of a GDP loss of $4.3 trillion, or 20.3% decrease in GDP on an annual basis. and the employment decline on a percentage basis is slightly lower. I might say, in looking at the real numbers, the hard numbers that are coming up now, we find that our estimates are tracking well, and it looks like we're going to be pretty close to being on the mark of the negative employment impacts, for example. The negative impact slightly more than double for the 6-month mandatory closure case. And the reason they more than double is that our model has several nonlinearities in it. And so it's not surprising that things get increasingly worse over time, and not just a mere doubling by the doubling of the length of time of the closure. The U.S. impacts are estimated to be higher than for China and the rest of the world, as indicated in the wording here that you can read and that Terrie explained. But we point out that our results are somewhat of an upper bound because they don't factor in the countervailing fiscal or monetary policies, but those are going to have a limited effect in terms of a lot of consumer spending in any case in the short run because businesses are shut down. We also haven't factored in vaccination, which is not available, but perhaps some other immediate healthcare improvements that may be saving some lives, but again, don't have any effect on mandatory closure. And we haven't, while we've factored in telework, there are other kinds of resilience that we haven't included, such as inventory holdings of businesses that may not be forced to close on a mandatory basis, but would otherwise not have some critical input into their production process from a business that was closed. What's most important is our future work, where we're going to focus on a phased reopening of the economy, avoidance behavior in terms of people being hesitant to send their kids to school. Hence, many will still have to stay at home to take care of their children, even if they want to work, even if their places of employment are open. They may also want to avoid mass gatherings and mass transit, which is inhibiting as well. We will also be factoring in pent-up demand once businesses open and the stay-at-home orders are relieved. Healthcare costs, which actually can have a bit of a stimulating effect on the economy, and any significant effects on the labor force through many more deaths and hospitalizations due to the pandemic. So let me just conclude with that, but refer you to the next slide, if you bring up the next slide, and I'm sure this will be posted, and this slide 18 is a list of the many studies we've done in the health threat area over the last 12 years. And the website for CREATE is just create.usc.edu, and there are a lot of other things about ongoing research, our media attention that we've received for our work, and many of our external fellows at other universities, such as Vig Beer at the University of Wisconsin, Robin Dillon Merrill at Georgetown University as well. So we're happy to take some questions. I note that there are 5 at the bottom of the screen. Harley, though, what's the protocol for answering questions?
Terrie, if you could stop sharing your screen, I'm going to make this into the viewer mode. The PowerPoint will be available on our website, on the Price Talks Policy in a Pandemic series website, and everyone can be able to view everything there. And I will go ahead and start the questions for you. So first question, there is a simple way out of the lives versus livelihood dilemma. Print the money needed to make up a percentage, 100%, of the individual, company, nonprofit, and government agency lost income, profit, or revenue as far long as the pandemic lasts. However, this is because of the threat of future potential inflation. Seems far worse than the certain loss of 70,000 or more lives. Why is this?
Oh boy, that's a multi-part question. So there is a debate about how much of a stimulus there should be. And one of the problems is a stimulus will only go so far in the short run because people aren't able to get out and really buy things, but at least they'd be able to pay their rent and some of their ongoing bills. I'm not an expert on macro policy to where I can say we've got too little or not enough. Though it does strike me many people are suffering, and there's probably more that can be done for the average individual. As far as printing money, the U.S. could do that, but it adds to the national debt. It may generate some inflation later on, but that's likely to be temporary. But I'd have to say most of the question is a little beyond our areas of expertise. Terrie, do you want to chime in on that?
Okay. I agree with what you said. Yep, I'm fine.
Okay.
All right, I'll go to the next question then. This question is, it's likely that we may close again due to viral resurgence. What can we learn from how the pandemic was handled so we can avoid extreme consequences again?
Right. Well, I'm sorry to pass the buck again, but that's a question you have to ask a health expert about whether we're reopening prematurely or not. But I'd only say one thing, and that is there is the possibility of another resurgence of the pandemic, in which case we'd have to start all over again, and the overall bottom line economic impacts would be worse. So it is a fine razor's edge that has to be traversed in terms of the optimal timing and amount of openings, and that has to be carefully assessed primarily by health experts, but we also need to assess the economic impacts of the closures, so our work contributes to that. But I echo one of the statements by the health experts. A lot of this really depends on the availability of testing. Dan, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's just to shows the shows the importance that we should in the next phase of analysis to consider both the economic impacts of the mandatory closures, the impacts to the economy, as well as the implications of the social distancing and other such mandatory policies that can help actually reduce the health consequences and the cost associated with that, and factor in those considerations in the decision making.
Okay.
Next question is, how can the unemployment numbers be improved? Will it be conditional on things opening up and people hiring again?
Well, I think we're doing all we can under mandatory closures. People have worked out the vagaries of telework. We're probably maxed out on that possibility. So it really is conditional on lifting the mandatory closures and people hiring again in part. But what's more complicated, and something we didn't have to deal with in this first phase because the mandatory closures dominate the behavioral considerations. So even if people wanted to go shopping, for certain goods, or in certain places, they're not going to be able to do that. But once the mandatory closures are lifted, that's only half the battle. The other half is people's willingness to venture out of their houses. And that's highly conditional on the information they received, how much they trust that information, and their own risk aversion. So a lot of people, and that's going to differ across the population. So risk messaging is going to be especially important, and it's a combination of the openings and people's behavior.
Okay, the next question is, are stimulus checks to individuals a significant support, or is there another option the government should consider during the shutdown time?
I don't have an immediate answer to that. Terrie, can you think of any other forms of support? Economic support?
I guess that's the main one. The other one might, yeah. No, it
Yeah,
has to be.
there could be things like, if people have IRS payments they need to make, they could defer those for a while. That would be another possibility that wouldn't involve much of a bureaucracy or having to mail checks out, but just giving people more time to pay their IRS amounts due. But that's the only thing I can think of.
Yeah, I think we also look at some other aspects in the coronavirus the aid package. I think there are also loans given out to small businesses, maybe help them.
Right. Good point. That's a good point.
Okay, the next question is, how quickly would you anticipate the GDP to recover after the closures are lifted?
Again, that depends a lot on human behavior, but we could take an extreme case and say, well, what if the closures are lifted, the stay-at-home orders are lifted, and everybody went back out and started shopping? So one of the things that comes out of the computal general equilibrium model, which essentially characterizes the economy as a set of interrelated supply chains, is that not everything can start back up all at once. You know, firm B may need some product from firm A, and it may take a couple of weeks for that product to be produced and delivered and then up the supply chain. So they're likely to be some staggered real production resumptions, and there are also likely to be some serious bottlenecks in parts of the economy. So that will delay, you know, things a few months, and after that, it will take a while. One of the things that will happen, though, is there's a lot of pent-up demand. And so people will not only be spending their usual spending, let's say for the month of September, but also making up for some lost time. So there'll be a sharp stimulus, but it's still going to be stunted by the things I mentioned. I think the prevailing wisdom is that it will take at least 2 years for the economy to recover, and possibly longer from all the dislocations and problems. Terry, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, 2 years sounds about right. So generally what happens in an economy that's working well, you kind of clear unemployment, you know, a third of it each year. So, you know, it takes a couple of years. In this case, it's obvious, you know, there'll be this pent up demand, which hopefully means that a lot more people get back to work in the first year, but these things happen gradually. So it's, yeah, I'd say two years is probably a good estimate.
Okay, next
Dan,
question.
anything else? Go ahead.
No.
Do you want to add anything? Okay.
No.
Go ahead, Harley.
Okay. Does your model take into account the permanent closure of businesses? For example, Soup Plantation has gone out of business because it's buffet-based dining, which will not be tenable for 6 to 12 months. This will be true for many dining and leisure businesses.
Well, that's a very good point, and there are a lot of business closures. One thing about bankruptcy, though, so when a big company declares bankruptcy or a small one, doesn't mean they're going out of business tomorrow. It simply means they're actually getting some legal protection against their creditors and working out an arrangement where they can pay their creditors something less than what they owe them so as to be able to continue to operate. So many businesses come under that categorization. Smaller businesses, it's really unfortunate. One thing I've always been impressed by is what we call the resilience of individuals and communities to deal with crises. It's been found time and time again, and I expect it will happen here. So many of the outfits that look like they're going out of business, I would suspect will be able to revive if they would like to. One of the things to mention is on business closures, the literature on natural hazards has found that not so many businesses fail. The ones that fail were ones that were marginal in the first place. And for a lot of them, it's not necessarily the hazard that actually ultimately causes them to fail. They were likely to be going out of business anyway. It's just accelerated that failure. So that's a significant percentage, by no means all, but it's another response to that question.
Next question is, given reductions in manufacture of various products, how could your modeling identify strategic ways for the U.S. to pivot and supply its own supply chain?
Okay, so I guess the model automatically will be looking for other places to find the supply chain. So in the model, there's certain in the data, it tells you where a producer, a firm, gets its particular goods from. And what will be happening is if one is unavailable, it will companies react and they automatically pivot to look at other sources of that supply. Now, strategically, I guess, yeah, we could look at those relationships and then be able to do something that helps to pivot without having to pay the higher prices.
Good answer.
Okay. Another question. After the pandemic, how would you assess the prospect of a relocation of manufacturing industries back to the U.S.? Will the deglobalization become a new normal?
Boy, that is a very tough question. I think there's so many unknowns associated with that. It's probably too early to tell. It'll depend on how safe companies feel in other countries. There'll probably be a flight away from countries that didn't handle the pandemic very well. Not entirely, not everybody's going to uproot themselves, but if it's a close call as to whether to stay or move back to the U.S., that may tilt things in favor of coming back. And otherwise, a lot of people predict major dislocations. Things will never be the same from an economic standpoint. Others have pointed out, ironically, that disasters provide opportunities. They get people to think more broadly, think innovatively. There's something called creative destruction, where any rebuilding or reformulation of everything from supply chains to contractual arrangements between firms might be revisited and improved. We're likely to see more inventories, better health care provision, a lot of things that will help out, but probably too many unknowns to really predict whether deglobalization is going to be vastly accelerated by the pandemic.
Yeah, I also just bringing in the time aspect to it. Over time, I think there's a tendency to go back to move back to things that work. So if there's improvements, then absolutely they'll take those on board. Things will definitely change, but over time, if you get goods that are cheaper or better from another country, then you will eventually go back to them. May not happen in the next 3 years, but
okay.
But eventually.
Dan, any final words?
I agree your assessment on this issue. This might be a slow process, but anyway, international trade, there will be different factors, especially the price and costs associated with that. Putting manufacturing facilities in other countries, what the implications of the cost of production and doing business that way. So maybe it will not go back to entirely go back to the old normal way, but gradually, if there's not second wave or third wave of this occurring, then I agree with Terrie, maybe in 2 or 3 years, we will see largely not the deglobalization may not likely to, happen as some of us would anticipate under this pandemic.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Adam and Terrie and Dan. As I mentioned, this recording, as well as the slides from today, will be available on our website. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Price Talks. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, Harley, for arranging this. Bye, everybody. Thank the audience for the great questions. And thanks, Terrie and Dan.